Hey everybody, I'm Hugh Brownstone for Three Blind Men and an Elephant. Welcome to part 2 of the series I'm calling The GH5 Has Me Thinking. In today's episode, let's talk lens selection, as in, if I buy the Panasonic GH5, even though I'm a Sony shooter, will I have access to the lenses that best meet my needs? Now, in order to do that, I, and you, if you're contemplating the GH5, need to ask, what are our needs exactly? And what are the differences between needs and wants? But in order to do that, let's begin with two paintings. Stay with me, please. This first one, a portrait of an old man, is clearly the work of a talented, classically trained artist. Now this second one, well, if you've never seen it before, your first question might be something like, what the heck am I looking at? What the heck is this? Without any understanding or even conscious thought, you might find it jarring, unsettling, ugly, frightening, confusing, or all of that and more. As well you might, because for those of you who don't already know, this second painting is actually an 11 by 25 foot black and white mural on permanent display at the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Reina Sofia in Spain, entitled Guernica. It was completed in 1937, a horrifying representation of the Nazi German and fascist Italian bombing of the town by the same name during the Spanish Civil War. What may be a surprise even to those of you who know Guernica is that both paintings are the work of Pablo Picasso, one of the greatest artists of the 20th century and probably all time. Even more surprising? How about this? The first one, entitled The Old Fisherman, was done more than 40 years earlier, 1895 to be exact, when Picasso was less than 20 years old and still learning his craft. Which, you may ask, has precisely what to do with the GH5 and lens selection? And that is a great question. Here's the point. It was only after he'd mastered his craft, lived life, and found his own voice that he could cast aside the ambition of or need for realism and precision in his work for something profoundly more original and of greater importance. I ain't no Picasso, but in other words, for me, not necessarily for you, I am so early in my video journey, even at my advanced age, that I'm not yet ready to embrace the character and artistry of imperfect glass. While I can appreciate that an accomplished DP or a true artist might choose to use vintage glass to achieve a certain look, hey, listen, yesterday, legendary CineLens manufacturer Cooke announced the availability of uncoated front elements for its S4i series, saying that this offers more choices to cinematographers with lower contrast, milkier shadows, flares, streaks, and other aberrations that give a vintage look. What I want for the work I do, web commercials, product intros, gear reviews, interviews, and the like, along with my own personal work, is as little chromatic aberration or distortion as possible in lens. I want sharp, fast, contrasty, native mount autofocus, lens side image stabilization, and while we're at it, I want my lenses small, all within what is feasible given my budget. So with this out of the way, namely that imperfection can be a beautiful thing, and just to be complete, let's be clear that there is a world of difference between this kind of imperfection and the poor sharpness and poor correction of consumer-grade lenses. let's now throw away the fact that there are about a cajillion billion lenses which can be adapted to any micro four thirds camera, including the GH5, because as a result of my limitations, I don't care about most of them. Instead, I want to share with you my process for establishing my lens criteria and how I came up with the number of lenses for the GH5 that continue to make it an intriguing option for me. Which, by the way, is one. Yeah, as in one lens. Now, it's not as bad or ridiculous as it sounds, but it is pretty important, pretty interesting. So let's keep going. Why do I want Tack sharp? Because while I can always dial it down in post, or even in camera before I shoot, I have never been able to goose sharpness in post except when it's for resizing the image, and be satisfied with the result. It just doesn't look good to me. Not nearly as good as the real thing. Why do I want fast? Well, I want fast because, one, I like sending as much light to the EVF as possible to help me see what I'm framing and focusing. Two, I like sending as much light to the sensor as possible so I can use the lowest ISO and get the lowest noise and widest dynamic range, which is especially important when contemplating a smaller sensor. Three, I like and use shallow depth of field often as a way of isolating what's important. Yes, you can kind of sometimes add blur in post, and in the future, computational imaging will make that happen in video. But for now, and the next few years, it looks exactly like what it is, still images only, and most of the time, sometimes I do, but most of the time, I don't like it. Why do I want native mount autofocus? Because in my experience, and I know some of you may have different experience, native mount autofocus works better, faster, more reliably most of the time. Autofocus is almost always better than I am, even when I take my time to slow things down, and it's just less complicated. In other words, the first rule of photography or filmmaking is don't blow the focus. Autofocus preserves options that I don't have in post. Now, I should pause here for a moment to say that I hate manually focusing fly-by-wire lenses. It's not that I hate manual focusing, which is why I love Zeiss Milvus and Loxia lines, Voigtlander, Noctons and Heliars, and Vajra mini primes, but they are, for me, luxuries rather than necessities. Still, nice to know they're there. Why do I want image stabilization? Well, because at least for stills, which is a chunk of what I do as a hybrid image maker, I can slow the shutter down, let more light in, and again, reduce the ISO to improve noise and dynamic range. In video, it can help me in a jam for dynamic camera movement, although it's still no gimbal. And finally, I can always turn it off to prevent strange artifacts when the camera is locked down on a tripod. Oh, one more thing about native mount. Olympus and Panasonic don't yet play well together, nor Sigma for that matter, when it comes to coordinating IS between lens and body. If you want the full Monty stabilization from Panasonic, you need to use Panasonic lenses. I know. You're going to tell me I don't need lens IS if I have in-body image stabilization. But you know what? If you don't have it, you don't get the full advantage of Panasonic's dual IS, which is 5 stops, but only if body and lens are stabilized and communicating with each other. Otherwise, it's 3. 2 additional stops is the difference between shooting at, say, ISO 1600 or ISO 6400. From a noise perspective and dynamic range perspective, that's going to be a noticeable to the non-pixel peeping naked eye kind of deal. But hey, I agree with you. I got along fine without IBIS until now, and I could go on without it in the future. But now that I've worked with it, I want it, all of it, and I want it to be good. That's part of what makes the GH5 so interesting. Why do I want chromatic aberration and distortion minimized in the lens itself rather than relying on what is pretty amazing built-in software correction? It's because I'm seeing more and more of it, especially chromatic aberration from very expensive glass, even without pixel peeping, and it bugs me and has me wondering why I'm being asked to pay so much. Chromatic aberration in video is especially difficult to correct. Let's face it, for me anyway, it's impossible to correct. I haven't found a way to do it. So please chime in if you know how to crush it in Final Cut Pro X. Still, images is something very different. And finally, my old Canon lenses had very little of it, except for the lenses I never really liked, like the 17 to 35 millimeter 2.8L. Why do I want small? Because I'm getting old and grumpy, and I'm getting tired of hauling a lot of gear, number one. Number two, the quality of imagery and footage coming from my A6300 has changed my reference point for the trade-off between image quality and portability. And if I'm going down to micro four thirds, I want it to be smaller. The quality of imagery and footage coming from my iPhone 7 Plus is also changing my reference point for portability. I like being out in the world and being unobtrusive as I capture it. And in an infinitesimally small way, smaller gear means a smaller ecological footprint, although who's kidding who? Yeah, the most sustainable approach to gear is buying used and buying very little of it. So let's move on. But at least I'm thinking about it. And finally, why do I want all of this at a reasonable price point? Duh. Because when I travel, when I divert money from gear to experiences or stretching my creative boundaries, I want to travel light. I want to be sure that I get the image quality I want because it's likely to be my only chance. And I need to be able to afford the tickets and lodging for being there. No do-overs when you travel. Now, about that one lens, back to the number of tack sharp, fast, native autofocusing, image stabilized, really well corrected, small lenses available for the GH5 today. And how does the answer compare to other systems from Canon or Sony, especially when you figure in cost? That one lens I mentioned earlier, it's probably no surprise to those of you who know micro four thirds, is in fact the image stabilized Leica Nocticron 42.5mm f1.2 at the moment. But it's the only one, only if you relax the price and chromatic aberration criteria a little bit. I mean, at almost $1,600, the Nocticron is the equivalent of a full-frame 85mm f2.4. For comparison, the brilliant and image-stabilized full-frame coverage Zeiss Batis 85mm 1.8 is $400 cheaper. Yet, only the Nocticron is good enough to allow the full expression of the GH5's unique constellation of capabilities, most notably in this instance dual IS and 10-bit 422 4K 400 megabit per second intra-frame recording. Now, why is this idea of full expressions of capabilities such an important consideration for me? Because, hey, if the GH5 offers a bunch of stuff that can't be used often, what's the point? Or at least, what's the point of buying it now? Hold that thought. There are a handful of other lenses that do the business in my book when you begin to relax the criteria a little further. The bargain price, Sigma 30mm f1.4 at $339, although it isn't image stabilized. The relatively bargain priced Leica DG 15mm f1.7 at $598, though again, no image stabilization and a bit more chromatic aberration than I'd like. The brilliant little Olympus 75mm f1.8 at $899, no image stabilization, and by the way, I've used all of these lenses. Now, if you relax the criteria a bit further, in fact, more than I'm willing to do at the moment, the brilliantly sharp but large, heavy, awkwardly ranged, and unstabilized Sigma 18-35 1.8, or the just announced Leica DG 12mm f1.4 at almost $1,300, expensive, with image quality assumed but to be determined, or the Leica DG 12-62.84, which is too slow in my book, and maybe or maybe not sharp enough, are additional lenses to explore. Now, let's compare this to Canon and Sony, because that's a whole lot less glass than the number of Canon lenses that fit my criteria for sharpness, speed, and chromatic aberration, also autofocus. It's even less than Sony, though that's only because you can mount full-frame Sony E-mount glass on the APS-C censored A6 series. Oh, and by the way, have an upgrade path to a higher spec sensor via the A7 series. You don't think so? You don't think the difference is that much? Well, take a walk through DxOMark. Yeah, I know. DxOMark is sometimes a bit funky, a little cryptic, clearly large volume manufacturer biased, and doesn't test video. But still, for the most part, it's pretty darn good when checked against my own experience. So look deeply into the numbers for yourself and correlate them with your own experience. Although it's not a slam dunk to compare lenses for different sensors and brands, try by approximating an apples-to-apples comparison through matching those lenses to similar megapixel count bodies. That's what I did. So, in fact, let me give you a starting point. Based on my experience with a pile of Canon glass over the years, from full-frame L zooms and the most astounding lens I've ever owned, the 200mm 1.8L, to EF primes, and then to consumer-grade EFS lenses, look at the number of lenses with sharpness scores of 12 perceptual megapixels or more, chromatic aberration scores of 10 micrometers or less, and maximum aperture of no smaller than f2.8 mounted on the 21 megapixel Canon 5D Mark II, the 18 megapixel 100D, and 7D Mark II. Now, compare that to the number of micro four thirds lenses mounted on the Olympus EPL5 with scores I set based on my experience with native mount Leica, Panasonic, and Olympus glass on the little Panny GX85. Look for lenses with at least 10 perceptual megapixels for sharpness, maximum aperture of 2.0 or faster, and no more than 10 micrometers for chromatic aberration. Why the EPL5? Because it's the camera supporting the highest DxOMark rated micro four thirds lenses there. No, they haven't posted lenses yet against the OMD EM1 Mark II or the 20 megapixel Panny GX8. Then, by the way, also check for lenses mounted to the Sony a6000 with my attempt to compensate for sensor size and pixel count with scores of 12 perceptual megapixels or better for sharpness, aperture of f2.8 or better, and 10 micrometers or better for chromatic aberration. Again, because to my eyes, these are the thresholds for really, really good glass. I could see chromatic aberration that bothered me without pixel peeping on, say, the otherwise awesome Sony E24mm 1.8 at 12 micrometers compared to just 2 micrometers on my little favorite, the E50mm 1.8 OSS. Again, both tested with the A6000. Or Canon's EFS 55 to 250 millimeter STM I bought and quickly sold a few years ago once I got the footage up on my screen. I was really disappointed with it. And there it is on DxOMark, scoring a miserable 7 perceptual megapixels on the 7D Mark II. Thinking more deeply, along with the concept of full expression of capabilities, let's recap. So, One lens squeaks by my criteria, and a handful of lenses come close enough. But I didn't find one zoom or telephoto in the Micro Four Thirds world that did come close. Which leads me to the following questions, answers, and epiphanies. 1. Could I be happy with an 85mm f2.4 and 150mm 3.4, which are the full frame equivalents of the Nocticron 42.5 and the Oli 75? Astoundingly, the answer is yes. I realize that I've never bought a full frame lens faster than 1.4, and my current kit ranges between 1.8 and 2.8 on crop sensor bodies. This means that I'm already used to and already use maximum depth of field full frame equivalents between f2.8 and f4.2. Holy crap. Then again, think about all the Super 35 geared cine lenses from Zeiss, Schneider, Vedra, and more, with t-stops ranging from 2.1 to 3.6. I guess it shouldn't come as much of a surprise to me as I imagined. Next question. Whose standard am I using when I think about optical blemishes or imperfections? My clients or mine? Mine. Most of my clients would be happy with less, but I wouldn't. Because the idea of putting so much time and effort into a finished project and then seeing anything less than stellar image quality on my 27-inch 5K Retina iMac galls me. I can't let up on my criteria, especially when I've found it impossible to correct CA in post, and I'm used to the image quality of my A6300. Next, what is it about the GH5 that is truly appealing, and does that even make sense? Oh boy. Let's start with 10-bit 422 4K 400 megabit per second all intra codec recording. It's about maximum image quality, right? But do I have the editing horsepower for that kind of stream? No, I don't think I do. I've just upgraded to handle 100 megabit per second 820 4K. Next, will I be distributing through a medium that will allow all of that IQ to come through if I did? No. I distribute 100% of my stuff through the web with all of its compression and artifacts. Lenses don't matter as much in these cases. Even if I answered differently and remained excited by the much richer color space and fewer motion artifacts, what does that mean if I don't grade? Well, first, it must mean that I want to capture gradations, like those one finds in nature, golden hour skies, which I do, and that in turn means two things. I need as much dynamic range as possible, and I don't have as much control over lighting as I do in a studio or the Batcave. I begin to wonder about noise again. Lenses don't matter as much in this case unless they are super fast and crispy. Except maybe I don't care about noise as much as I think either. After all, I love this pre-dawn imagery, noise and all, which I shot last week on a freaking iPhone. Now, if I don't want motion artifacts, that means I want to capture moving objects, right? But doesn't this mean I want awesome autofocus? Will I bump into issues with the contrast detection only autofocus of the GH5? Will I bump into ISO issues I've overcome in my head because in still mode I may want higher shutter speeds? Now, the Olympus 300mm f4 is a full frame equivalent of f8, or an APS-C Super 35 equivalent of f6. Will it be fast enough and sure enough to give me what I want? You know, I doubt it, but this is to be determined. Let me put it differently. Even if the lens itself has great autofocus and is fast, sharp, and well corrected, is its fullest expression going to be gated by the GH5 camera body itself? On the other hand, if IQ and cinematic quality is my or your ultimate goal, then who cares about autofocus? At which point we have the f0.95 Noctons if we can't light, or as I mentioned earlier, Zeiss, Schneider, Vedra, and now Sigma Cineglass 2 if we do. Let's talk about dual IS. If this is the siren call of the GH5 for you or me, then IQ is again a top priority, but this means in the context of being handheld, right? Because you're going to need to turn off IS of any kind when you mount the GH5 or any other image stabilized camera or lens on a tripod. But depending on the setup, dual IS could be a great complement to gimbals and certainly to handheld movement. Well, in this case, we really do want lightweight and we want small. Otherwise, forget about something like the Crane or Crane M, like if you're thinking of the Sigma 18-35. Now you're talking about a much higher payload, much more expensive, two-handed gimbal, which defeats the idea of small, unobtrusive, and inexpensive altogether. And if you want IS, you're definitely going to want lens IS to get the full 5 stops, communicating with the body, as I said before. But think not only between ISO 1600 and 6400, think about the difference between ISO 400 and 1600. Let's talk about price. If this is what gets you going, it means you're on a budget, right? Well, I've found that limitations cause bursts of creativity, so that's good, but suddenly you're paying a lot for the kind of lenses I'm talking about, quickly closing the gap between the ticket for micro four thirds and APS-C or even full frame. Even when you figure in the body, there's less money for lighting, less money for travel, less money for editing suite upgrades. Ugh, my head hurts. But let's continue. What if what rocks your world about the GH5 is more in the realm of workflow, operation, ease of use? Those dual side-mounted card slots? Check. I hate having to remove my camera from a quick release plate to get at the cards, or battery, because then it's not really quick release or repeatable, is it? And I do have hard card failures, which, to use the technical term, sucks. The full-size HDMI port? Check. Then I can use a real monitor again and not worry about losing the connection. The 3.7 megapixel EVF, ooh, tasty check. Every advantage I can give myself to actually see what I'm shooting is a real value to me now. The USB 3 port, check. The faster I can get all of those gigabytes of footage onto my computer, the less often I have to use an SD card, the better. Dual IS that looks like it's much better than Sony's? Yeah, check. What's the point in buying IBIS unless it's great? A much more fully featured app than Sony? Check. Touch focus, manual focus, and fuller controls, including things like focus peaking, make a big difference when I'm shooting solo. The absence of a 30-minute recording limit or worry-free of overheating? Check, 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 check. Big time. So, I keep looking at the GH5, turning it over and over in our heads, and coming to grips with the large spend we're contemplating. And trying to determine if, taken together, a compelling reason or set of reasons exists to click buy now, buy here, pre-order. But you also begin to wonder if maybe you could give up a bunch of this stuff and still decide, yes, there is indeed a sweet spot for a first micro four thirds addition to a Sony's shooter's kit. In which case, you might start to think about the little GX85 for now, with, say, the Sigma 30mm f1.4 mounted on a tripod, which, of course, is what you've been seeing this entire episode. From Picasso, the Old Fisherman, and Guernica, to my bat cave here in Philly with a $600 camera, a $340 lens, and an iPad sitting just below me. Thanks for sticking with me on this particular journey. In episode 3, we'll turn to autofocus in more detail and tidy up a bunch of loose ends. I just want to mention one more thing. The knowledge, humor, generosity, and intelligence of the comments following episode 1 have just been tremendous. Personally educational, affirming, humbling, and exciting, even entertaining. Guys, thank you so much. If you like what you've seen today, thumbs up, subscribe, join the conversation. And please remember that if you do use the crassly commercial affiliate links here to buy your gear, it will help me to spend more of my time with you doing the things I love, like this. For 3 Blind Men and an Elephant, I'm Hugh Brownstone. See you next time.